Okay, yes, so hello everyone. So I'm Peter Levell. Before Agnes goes on to talk in more detail about the worker level impacts and before Alan goes on to talk a bit more about negotiations and the different Brexit deals on the table, I'm going to try and set the scene a bit by talking a bit about the UK's position in global trading networks and its position in global value chains in particular. So our starting point is that much of the public discussion on trade talks in terms of trade in what we call final goods. So those are goods that are sold for final use. They could be British pharmaceuticals, they could be Japanese cars, they could be French wine. And when we're thinking about trade agreements, we're usually thinking in terms of, or talking in terms of, how much greater access could we get for, say, British pharmaceuticals if we granted greater access for, say, Japanese cars. It turns out, though, that much trade doesn't take this form. Much trade takes the form of what we call intermediate goods. So these are inputs into the production of other things. So they could be things like car engines or other components used in manufacturing. It could be basic chemicals that are used to make pharmaceutical products. Or they could be services, so offshored administrative functions from a bank or something that might be done in a different country. These inputs are now increasingly crossing borders because production has become fragmented both across industries and across countries. And that's through the rise of what we call global value chains. So, excuse me. So how important are these sorts of trade flows? So it so happens that for the UK, these kind of trade in intermediate goods account for the majority of the UK's trade. So to look at that, we've just got a chart here, and it's going to show you the fraction of UK imports that take the form of these intermediate goods as opposed to these goods for final use. And we're going to look at them over time from 2000 to 2014. And we've got them here for the EU, and you can see them rising from just over half of our trade to a bit more at the end of the period, and from non-EU countries. So for non-EU countries, 59% of our imports take the form of these intermediate goods rather than final goods. And for the EU, it's 56%. And when you look at exports, the patterns are even more stark. So over 2/3 of our exports to the European Union take the form of these intermediate goods rather than final goods, and just over 60% of our exports to non-EU countries take that form. And all this matters because it has consequences for the way you might want to think about trade policy. So this means when you're thinking about an agreement, you shouldn't be thinking just in terms of how am I going to reduce barriers facing my exports in other markets. The success, even when you're thinking just in terms of narrowly in terms of your export success, your success is also going to depend on whether you have access to high-quality intermediate goods at low cost from abroad. So, for example, can the inputs you're bringing in be used from foreign countries be used in just-in-time production chains for manufacturing industries? It's also going to depend on the export success of the countries you're supplying to. And that includes, for example, that those countries' access to your own market, because you may supply industries there that then export in turn to you. So what we're trying to do here is we want to understand the importance of foreign content for UK exports and for different UK industries. So that could be, how important are, for example, German-made engines for British-made cars. And the second thing we want to understand is how important are UK intermediates for industries in the EU that then export elsewhere. So, for example, that could take the form of supplying aircraft wings to an aircraft manufacturer in France, which then ultimately exports its aircraft to Latin America. So UK value added is indirectly exported to Latin America in that way. And these things are important because they allow us to assess a key trade-off in the UK's future trade policy, which is, so we could have less integration with the EU. That will presumably imply higher trade costs with the EU. But by operating an independent trade policy, the idea is that we'll reduce those trade costs with other non-EU countries. And these global value chains are going to affect that trade-off because we might gain more direct access to other third country markets, but at the same time, we might lose access to European value chains that are servicing those same markets. and both of those things would have to be taken into account. So in what I'm going to describe, I'm going to be referring to this key concept, which is value added, and in particular value-added exports as opposed to a country's gross exports. So before I go on, I'm just going to go through a very stylized example just to explain what I mean by that. So suppose we have a very simple value chain. We've got three countries, got France, the UK, and we've got Germany. And we say the UK exports £1 billion worth of cars to France. So those are the UK's gross exports to France. That's what you'd see in the normal ONS trade statistics. And so the UK's gross exports to France are just going to be £1 billion. So suppose to make those cars, the UK has to import components, in this case tires, from Germany. And suppose they take a value of £500 million. That means when the UK is manufacturing those cars, it's adding £500 million to those inputs it's imported from Germany. And its value-added exports to France are going to be less than its gross exports. They're going to be 500 million. And its value-added share relative to gross exports is going to be 0.5 or 50%. At the same time, Germany, it's not directly exporting to France, but it is exporting value-added to France through the UK. So in this case, its value-added exports to France are just going to be £500 million, because that's a value-added that's embedded in these cars. Okay, so let's talk about what those foreign value-added shares are for the UK. So here we've got the share of domestic value added in exports for the UK over time. And you can see it's about 0.75. So for every £100 we export, those exports are going to embed £25 of content that actually comes from abroad. So how large is that share? So we can compare it to other European countries. So here we've got France and Germany. And you can see that at the beginning of the period, their domestic value-added shares were quite similar to the UK, but over time there's been this divergence. So France and Germany have started using more foreign value-added in their exports relative to the UK over time. So now their value-added shares are just a bit below 0.7 or 70%. And in fact, if you look across European countries, the UK has the highest domestic value-added share of all countries, and is one of only few countries for which that share is growing, although growing only very slightly over this period. What's the reason for that? So the key reason is that the UK is a major service exporter, and service industries make use of fewer inputs in general and fewer foreign inputs in particular. And that's the key driving reason for both the UK having a high value-added share, and because those service exports have grown in importance over time, why that value-added share has actually been slightly increasing. So that shows you sort of the overall that foreign value-added is not quite as important as it is in other European countries. They're still quite significant. But the importance of foreign inputs varies greatly across different industries. So to look at this, we're going to calculate what proportion of each industry's inputs take the form of imports, and also imports from the European Union. So this chart shows you the fraction of the production inputs each industry uses, whether goods or services, that come from abroad. And so we've got the total bar there that shows that 18% of inputs used by UK industries on average are imported. And the blue part of that bar shows you that around half of those come from the European Union at the moment. So then if we look at how that varies across industries, you can see there's quite a lot of variation. So the industries that make most use of foreign imports is the manufacturing industry, so about 30% of their imports, their inputs come from abroad, and just over half of that comes from the European Union. Further down, we've got agriculture, where 19% of its inputs come from abroad. And lower down, we've got big service exporting industries. So here we've got the wholesale and retail trade, where 12% of inputs come from abroad, so it's a bit lower. Finance, where it's about 10%. So you can see that partly explains why this high service export share in UK exports means that its domestic value added is going to be higher. So because manufacturing is the industry that has the highest share of inputs, I've broken that down into different smaller industries that make up manufacturing. So you can see that the coke and petroleum industry is the one that makes use of most imports. Most of it come from outside of the European Union. And the food products is at the other end of the scale, so they actually source most of their inputs domestically. So if you thought, so you might have thought that they might be one industry that would benefit from perhaps reductions in the high tariffs that are currently charged on food inputs. You need to take into account that actually many of the inputs they're currently using are taken from the UK already. And then sort of in the middle, we've got motor vehicles industry that uses quite a high share of imports as well, so 37%. And when you look specifically at which of those ones are making most use of EU inputs, so it's motor manufacturing uses about a quarter of its inputs from the EU, followed by chemicals at 23%. And then there's pharmaceuticals and electrical equipment, which both have both source about 21% of their inputs from the EU. Okay, so now thinking about how much of the value added that the UK exports passes through the EU as an intermediary onto other destinations. So to just explain what I'm doing here, I've got another stylized global value chain. So suppose we want to think about how large are the trade flows that pass the EU on the way to China. So the UK could export to China in various ways. So it could just export directly, or it could supply a firm in, say, the United States that then takes those British-made components or British services and turns them into exports, which it then exports to China. Or the UK could supply firms in the EU, for example, the German car industry, and they could, in turn, export those things to China. And in that way, UK value added will end up being exported to China. So our aim here is just to understand how important is this bit. How important is the UK value added that passes through the EU to China relative to the UK value added that might be exported either directly or through other countries? So to look at that here, we've got UK value added exports that are exported. So the £260 billion figure represents the UK value added exports, all UK value added exports that end up outside the EU. So about £260 billion of UK value added ends up being consumed outside of the EU. And of that, £34 billion of that goes through the EU first in that way I described. So about 13% of that is value added that passes through the EU. Then we can look at how that breaks down by different countries. So about £52 billion of UK value added is consumed in the United States. And of that, about £5 billion is through a European value chain, or about 9%. When you look at China, about £20 billion of UK value added, of which $3 billion passes through the EU, so a share of about 15%. And the third most important country is Switzerland, where £9 billion of UK value added is consumed, $2 billion passes through the EU, and that's a share of 17%. So Switzerland being a bit higher than the other countries, because obviously it's closer to Europe and it's closer to the UK. So how significant are these sorts of numbers? So what they mean is that based on current trading patterns, if the UK value added passing through the EU were lost, then what would the UK, you can think about what would the UK need to do in terms of extra bilateral agreements, either with those countries I just mentioned, or with other countries to boost its exports to make up for that. So if that value added share going through European value chains were lost, value added exports to the US would need to increase by 10%, to China by 17%, and to Switzerland by 20%. So we think these are significant. And of course, these losses from which arise from greater barriers exporting to the EU will have to be added on top of any loss in value-added exports to the EU itself. Just to conclude, so the key trade-off I mentioned at the beginning is how much integration should the UK have with the EU versus how much should it try to pursue an independent trade policy. So there are a couple of factors here, important here that I haven't mentioned so far. So one is just the relative importance of the different export markets for the UK. The EU is the largest trading partner, so a loss of trade with the EU is going to imply a larger loss of trade, which is going to be difficult to make up for with bilateral agreements with other countries. The second thing is, can we strike these new agreements quickly? And the third is, how deep are they likely to be? Are they the sort of agreements that would just cover tariffs, or would they cover other non-tariff elements as well? So what we see is that based on current trading patterns, the domestic value-added shares in the UK are relatively high, but imported inputs, and particularly EU imported inputs, are particularly important for certain industries. So we mentioned motor vehicles and chemicals, and we'll talk a bit more about them later in Angus's presentation. And the second thing is that there's a potential loss of value-added exports to non-EU countries that arises because it becomes harder to trade with the EU. Okay, so that's me done. So I'm now going to hand over to Agnes, who's going to talk a bit more about the impacts of trade barriers with the EU on UK workers. Thank you.